to this event and issuing a very warm welcome to our speaker today, Jessica Campbell. Thank you, Jessica, for agreeing to take part in this series of talks. Jessica Campbell is an ESRC-funded PhD student in the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. Her current doctoral project, The Healing Arts, an examination of madness, creativity and experience in British asylum culture, explores the use and experience of arts-based therapies from reading and writing to the performing and visual arts within 19th century British institutional psychiatry, with an emphasis on the patient's perspective. Whilst Jessica's primary research interests lie within the history of psychiatry, she is interested in social histories of medicine more broadly, her ongoing work in collaboration with the Menstruation Research Network, and her involvement in projects such as the Abortion Act 1967, a biography, stimulating her interest in histories of reproductive health, gender, the body, and their relationship to mental health. And her talk for us today has a wonderful title, Oh, What a First-Rate Doctor is Dr. Drama, Theatre Performance and the 19th Century Asylum Stage. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much. So I'll dive right into it. So on the 12th of January 1843, the Dumfries Herald reported on a curious experiment taking place within the walls of a local insane asylum, the Crichton Royal Institution. This experiment, however, was a far cry from the dark and barbaric representations of psychiatric treatment that have come to characterise popular and historical narratives of psychiatric practice, and that arguably continue to feed society's enduring fascination with the spectre of madness today. The journalist's report was not a tale of patient abuse or straitjackets or scandal, nor was it a story about evil psychiatrists experimenting with their latest scientifically approved toys upon a captive population. Rather, it was the story of a triumphant introduction of a new venture to the asylum's therapeutic programme, the dramatic arts. The archival remnants of British psychiatric institutions are replete with references to the use of the dramatic arts as a form of recreation, amusement and cure. Yet the role and significance of the histrionic arts as a form of therapy within psychiatric institutions has received only cursory attention. Responding to Juliet Foster's call for scholars to dig deeper into the largely unwritten history of theatrical performances in psychiatric contexts, this paper explores the rationale behind, the implementation and experience of the dramatic arts in the British Insane Asylum. Drawing upon the writings of medical superintendents, the literature of patient-produced magazines, and a mix of cultural ephemera, including theatrical playbills and press cuttings, it seeks to develop excellent histories of asylum performances to consider the expressive and potentially subversive possibilities that the stage might have offered patients themselves. In doing so, it endeavours to question and complicate the existing literature's emphasis on the disciplinary function of theatrical performances in the asylum context by drawing attention to the polysemic nature of the dramatic arts as a complex feature of asylum therapeutics and culture. Most civilizations and societies have believed in the healing potential of the expressive arts, including creative participation and forms of ritual enactment. Archaeologists and classicists have pointed to a long-standing relationship between theatre, the dramatic arts and medicine, noting, for example, that dramatic performances formed a part of the ritual healing in the Grecian Asclepia, whilst classical thinkers have believed in and promoted the remedial effects of visiting the theatre upon the mad. Theatrical representations were also introduced into psychiatric institutional contexts across continental Europe prior to the emergence of the first theatricals at the CRI in the 1840s. In an anonymous paper now attributed to the leading alienist W.A.F. Brown, it is noted that around the turn of the century, French psychiatrist Jean-Etienne Esquirol attempted to introduce theatrical amusements at the Charenton as a means of enjoyment, if not cure, in the treatment of the insane. Plays were reported to have also been performed in asylums in Copenhagen and Naples at around the same time. The novelty of the performance recorded in the Dumfries Herald in 1843, therefore, was not necessarily due to the apparent uniqueness of staging a play in the psychiatric context. Exceptional for being the first to be staged in a British asylum, the buzz around this theatrical event at the Crichton Royal was also related to who was performing. It was the asylum's own patients. 5 thespians performed James Kenny's popular farce, Raising the Wind, on the 6th of January 1843, before an audience of 50 patients, the servants and officers of the institution, and a select handful of unidentified individuals who appear to have been exclusively invited to the inaugural theatrical. This first performance was considered such a triumph, a true example of the healing arts, that it was reported that it was to be performed again a week later, this time in front of a select audience from the local town. So began the Crichton's first theatrical season, which witnessed a range of performances which took place upon a small makeshift stage in the Asylum's boardroom into the spring of 1843. By the mid-19th century, the theatrical season had become a well-established feature of the therapeutic regime, and at the CRI, itself had transformed itself into a popular venue for both touring professional companies and for public local audiences who breached the walls of the asylum to watch the institution's very own dramatic corps with its mad actors perform. Proclaimed as the first psychiatric institution in Britain to employ the stage in the treatment of the insane, the Crichton Royal Institution Dumfries firmly established itself as a forerunner in the implementation of the histrionic arts within the British asylum regime. Not long after reports of the asylum theatricals hit the press, a form of drama fever swept across Britain's psychiatric institutions, which increasingly implemented theatrical representations alongside a whole host of other performances. It is clear from the reports within asylum periodicals that dramatic entertainments quickly became the highlight of the asylum's programme of amusements. The theatrical season stretching across the winter months when the weather was generally too poor for the preferred outdoor activities. Performance became such a staple of cultural life in the asylum that many institutions built their own theatres or recreation halls with stages dedicated to the arts. The purpose-built recreation hall with stage, props and scenery became an accepted space within institutions across Britain. 3 of the Royal Asylums in Scotland, Fulbourn, Bethlehem and Brooklyn Asylums in England all had established fixed multi-purpose stages by the turn of the century, while at the Murray Royal Asylum in Perth, they adopted a more flexible approach by installing a movable stage, which included stage lights, scenery and side doors. The result was, according to a patient writer, that the stage and drama had become one of the institutions of the place. Late 19th century postcards and photographs of the interiors of the asylum recreation hall offer snapshots of the stage and its requisite apparatus. Although a static image nearly always depicting these spaces as empty, when read alongside other evidence, it becomes possible to reconstruct or at least imagine performances in action. From ventriloquism to magic shows to comedies and pantomimes, theatre playbills and monthly amusement sections of patient-produced periodicals testify to an incredible variety of dramatic entertainments regularly taking place upon the asylum stage. Amongst the melange of dramatic performances recorded in the asylum's cultural ephemera, local dramatic groups or touring companies constituted a large proportion of the documented acts. However, upon closer inspection, it is evident that several asylums formed their own dramatic troupes. Drawing upon the latent talent of their staff and patients, the Edinburgh, Murray, Montrose Royal Asylums appear to have followed the CRI's blueprint, forming their own theatre companies who performed for both private and select public audiences upon their own stages. Notably, patients themselves were cast in key roles. At the Royal Edinburgh Asylum, for example, it is recorded in the asylum's annual report for 1845 that the first dramatic performances were in fact patient-led. In-house theatricals continue to make appearances in the records of the Royal Edinburgh Asylum across the second half of the 19th century, with writers of the Morningside Mirror, the in-house publication, often reporting upon staff and patient-produced productions at the Theatre Royal. Though a leader in the implementation of the histrionic arts within the asylum, the CRI was, by the mid to late 19th century, no longer an anomaly in its utilisation of its own internal talents for dramatic ends. So what had begun as an attempt was no longer an experiment, but a sanctioned mode of treatment. So to fully understand how theatre came to occupy such a prominent place in British institutional psychiatry, the introduction of the dramatic arts to the asylum must be placed within the wider context of its therapeutic programme. So dramatic performances formed just one facet of the preferred model of psychiatric treatment in the mid-19th century, which was moral therapy. Defined by leading asylum reformer and alienist W.A.F. Brown as every mode which the mind is influenced through the mind itself, in contradistinction to medical treatment, in which the mind is acted upon remotely by material agents. Moral treatment represented a paradigmatic shift in ideas and practices relating to the treatment of mental illness, and its implementation coinciding with a period of lunacy reform. Advocated as a more humane humane mode of caring for patients, Brown envisaged moral treatment as involving as great a number of moral means of cure, of restraining, persuading, engaging, and teaching the darkened and disordered mind as possible, and as such included activities that intended to occupy, distract, amuse, or to preclude subjective contemplations such as abstraction, remorse, reveries by external impressions, and to extirpate pernicious and perilous habits of thought or actions by engrafting new and numerous predilections, by creating new pursuits, wants, and hopes. The asylum's ultimate purpose, then, was to build up the unformed or ruined mind by training, educating, discipline, religious and intellectual influences. It should, as Brown argued, be a school and reformatory as well as a hospital. So discussions of asylum theatricals across the pages of the CRI's patient-produced magazine, The New Moon, echo Brown's views, suggesting that the introduction of the dramatic arts to the asylum was fundamentally shaped by the principles of moral treatment. Frequently described by patient writers as a school, the stage is often referred to as one of the most powerful instruments of civilization, a favourite vehicle of instruction, with theatrical performances having an instructive purpose, as well as an improving and remedial effect upon mad actors and mad audiences. Both practitioner and patient writing support Basil Kershaw's contention that performance is fundamentally a transaction of meaning. In the case of the 19th century asylum, this ideological transaction appears to be one of moral values, with performance offering a key tool with which to enact sane ideals. It would be expected then that the genre and content of plays performed on the asylum stage would be those most associated with high or refined culture. Yet, playbills and reports of dramatic entertainments in asylum magazines reveal that the predominant form of the asylum theatrical performance took the shape of comedic farces. At first glance, the farcical comedy seems at odds with the aim of inculcating rational thoughts and behaviour within patients. A nonsensical genre of theatre, farces are characterised by buffoonery and horseplay, crude characterisation, and the construction of highly improbable situations, and became a popular carnivalesque form of entertainment from about the 1840s. However, as Benjamin Rees argues, entertainment could be sanitised or reformed and in turn made acceptable and useful to the asylum authorities. Discussing patient performances on the stage of the New York Asylum, Rees notes that it was argued by American psychiatrists that farcical performances could aid patients' delusions and inculcate a sense of self-control, the hilarity supplanting the place of delusive ideas by exposing them as laughably incorrect. Contemporary physician John Galt noted with reference to asylum theatricals in Scotland that the farce was the ideal medium with which to achieve this. The healthful influence of hilarity incited by the performance of the farcical comedy was one healing aspect of the genre that, according to Galt, weaned the spirit from harmful introspection, encouraged the gratification of love of display, the awakening of emulative and social feelings. However, the ultimate effect of the farce on the insane performer or audience, he contended, would seem to be chiefly those of mental revulsion. The farce thus presented an ideal medium with which to comically confront individuals with examples of improper, insane behaviour, and in turn shock them into proper modes of conduct. Farces also contained the more serious themes of the Victorian novel, but presented in comedic and nonsensical dramatic forms. Rural virtue, social ambition, representations of domesticity and class conflict, especially the clash between representatives of new wealth and the older gentry, entwined with moral undertones and stories of guile, fraud, trickery and manipulation, which were all tied up with a happy and playful ending. Presenting patients with such stylised modes of incorrect behaviour, The asylum stage could in essence act as a mirror, providing a sort of reflective moral instruction on how not to behave. That the sanitised farcical comedy was the genre of the asylum stage may also explain the peculiar presence of another regular feature of the asylum's theatrical repertoire, blackface minstrelsy. Between 1860 and 1900, the British blackface minstrel show was at its height in wider Victorian society, and it was in this same period that it became a very popular genre within the asylum's theatrical scene as well. Much like the farce, the minstrel show was a carnivalesque and highly caricatured variety act, which could include anything from juggling, acrobatics and dancing to stump speeches, slapstick sketches and illusions. Whatever the variety of genres, the minstrel show did, however, follow a characteristic formula, performed by stock characters in dialect, which usually included rapid-fire crosstalk exchanges between diametrically opposed characters. So we have Mr. Interlocutor, representing a character of bourgeois status, and then we have two endmen, Bones and Tambo, representing the foolish and irresponsible lower classes, with slapstick humour, puns, and exaggerated gestures interrupting the more serious discourse. The stock characters would then be accompanied by a fiddle or a banjo player, with performers presenting theatrical content consisting of a unique blend of polite and vulgar cultures, which ultimately revolved around depicting highly stereotyped and racialized images of the African-American man, enslaved or free, and in some cases, African-American women. But the minstrel persona was, in essence, an antithesis to what bourgeois culture stood for. The other world and the world of the other was everything that the Victorian bourgeois ideal was not. And in this sense, the minstrel show stands out as a genre of performance somewhat out of place in the asylum's therapeutic regime. It was a world that aimed to cultivate respectable civility and normal, acceptable, sane behaviour within its subjects. Yet it seems that the minstrel show functioned much the same way as the farce. Audiences were presented with the self-indulgent and irresponsible Bones and Tambo, alongside the still inferior but more self-controlled Mr. Interlocutor, in a moral spectacle in which spectators were instructed in the do's and don'ts of respectable behaviour, and ultimately reminded of the bourgeois ideal with the added element of racial mockery. A review of the Royal Edinburgh Asylum's own minstrel performance in 1874 offers a glimpse of this in action. And notably, the review concludes with Dr. Newington wielding his baton over the minstrel performers, suggestive of the minstrel show and stage being used not only as a therapeutic tool, but as a kind of form of disciplinary spectacle. The performance was chaotic, but it was organised and disciplined mayhem. This combination of discipline with spectacle is discussed by Goffman in his critique of total institutions, in which he terms boundary-blurring activities such as this as institutional ceremonies, a set of institutionalised practices through which staff and inmates come close enough together to get a somewhat favourable image of one another. Fulfilling latent social functions, Goffman argues that these practices act as a regulating mechanism of the asylum machinery that counters the tensions that inevitably arise in a society dangerously split into inmates and staff. So an examination of the asylum's theatrical repertoire thus provides us with an unusual opportunity to watch what happens when official culture collides with an explosive popular form. One result of this collision seems to have been that the risky elements of theatrical performance were sanitised. Co-opted by asylum management, the dramatic arts were cast in a civilising role, and in doing so transformed what had the potential to be a corrupting influence into a sanctioned and appropriate form of mode of therapy. However, as Scott notes, the dominant never controlled the stage completely. Viewing the use of drama as an institutional ceremony, as simply another cog in the social control machinery of the asylum, arguably positions the patients themselves as passive, dismissing the impact and experience of the performances from the perspective of the patients. Such an interpretation fails to capture the nuance of the asylum's dramatic encounters. Theatricals may have been intended as morally instructive, as a means of inculcating sane behaviour and encouraging social conformity, but were they actually interpreted as such? How were performances received and experienced by patient actors and audiences beyond the placid official counts or the rose-tinted reports of the Asylum magazine? Was there any room for individuals' own creative expression? The dramatic arts may have been sanitized to counteract its risky nature as creative practice, but does the art ever completely lose its subversive power and expressive potential when framed in this way? Arguably, the complex dynamics of theatrical performance as an art form and a fundamentally relational social encounter needs to be taken into consideration. As Kershaw notes, whilst dramatic performance involves a transaction of meaning, this transaction is not unidirectional. Given that the spectator is involved in an active construction of meaning, the extent to which patient audience passively internalise the moral values or intended meaning of asylum theatricals is maybe questionable. It is possible that the stage functioned as a space in which patients could engage with alternative realities, giving both actors and spectators an opportunity for escapism and indulgence in imaginary worlds. Whilst plays may have been imbued with some form of moral lesson or presented patients with the ideal of how not to behave in an attempt to replace unreason with reason, the polysemic nature of the performance meant that it could have been open to a whole multitude of possible interpretations. The Asylum Minstrel Show offers a key example of how the Asylum Stage could act as a complex platform upon which the dramatic representation could be imbued with multiple meanings. Blackface minstrelsy involved the application of black makeup directly onto the skin of the faces of its predominantly white male performers. The use of makeup in this way was a form of masking, which created an ambiguous crossover site between mask and face, but also a site of transaction between self and other, identity and difference. This act of masking for patient performers may have offered an opportunity for the negotiation of identity, to hide one's mad self and to become somebody else. However, the blackface mask also had another function. Not only was it a marker of disguise, but a marker of representation. One cannot escape the fact that minstrelsy specialised in racial mockery, and as such, attendance at the minstrel show involved in visiting not only another world, but the world of the other. In this sense, it is possible that the minstrel show offered not only a form of escapism for patient performers and spectators, but acted as almost a levelling force. The imbalance of power signified by the boundary between staff and patient, sane and insane, could be supplanted through the joint mockery of another socially marginalised group. Such collective othering through the medium of performance may have liberated some patients from their stigmatised identities, laughing at someone else's plight, relieving their own sense of alienation. On the other hand, the struggle of black, often enslaved characters in the minstrel show may have been interpreted as a metaphor for the situation of the insane. As Rees points out, there are parallels between 19th century notions of blackness and madness, most notably in the shared notion of the childlike and savage or primitive nature of the mad and black individuals who it was argued needed to be guided through a civilizing process. Whilst asylum paternalism was not the same as the paternalism of slavery, it is possible that patient actors and spectators related in some way to the other characters that they adopted or watched upon the stage. The blackface minstrel performance, therefore, was a complex spectacle, layered with various functions and potential meanings. It offered a space in which one could simultaneously conceal and disguise, so hide the real you, impersonate, become somebody else, or mock another. The asylum theatre then could be a liminal space in which the usual roles of staff and patients were cast off, fostering moments of ambiguity. While there is little evidence to suggest that patients, spectators, or performers did not conform to social expectations, because dramatic performance is an inherently unstable form, it is also possible that asylum theatricals prompted unexpected reactions or behaviour. Whilst the content and performance of popular theatrical genres may have been sanitised to fit the institution's rationale, the rebellious nature of the farce and the nature of humour may have opened up opportunities for subtle modes of resistance and critique. As Scott notes, it is frequently in the interest of the dominant and subordinate groups to tacitly conspire in misrepresentation, the impression management in power-laden situations often forming one of the key survival skills of subordinate groups. Viewed from this perspective, patient audiences and patient actors were not necessarily the docile subjects that evidence would lead us to believe, but rather individuals with the agency to decide whether to follow the script or not. So, a close examination of the asylum's cultural miscellany demonstrates that the collisions between theatre and madness in the 19th century were anything but isolated acts. The story of psychiatry's dalliance with the dramatic arts is also one rife with complex tension and meaning. When viewed through the lens of the institution's public transcripts and considered within the context of moral treatment, it is hard to see the dramatic arts as anything but another tool of social and cultural regulation, a means of inculcating civilized values and behaviour within a population deemed deviant or other. The careful selection of plays performed within the asylum and the emphasis on what was appropriate content to perform suggests that theatricals did indeed contribute to a coercive pantomime of citizenship and civility, with performance intended as morally instructive and therefore potentially curative. Yet, whilst drama may have constituted a form of social regulation and cultural domination in the guise of artistic freedom, when we consider the nature of theatre and performance as an art form, the contention that the dramatic arts merely acted as an extension of moral treatment intended to inculcate socially conformist self-surveillance and modes of acceptable sane behaviour starts to unravel. By attempting to search for the hidden transcripts within the public transcript of official asylum ideology and acknowledging the plurality of patient experience, we can become more attuned to the alternative possibilities the stage may have offered, whether as moments of escapism and creative expression or of subversion and resistance to patient audiences and actors. To use these fragments of the past to explain the incomplete nature of our lives, states, institutions, and everyday geographies is essential if we are to write a history of asylum culture that considers the patient's view and creative experiences as part of the story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that absolutely fascinating